True Crime for Sleeping gently welcomes you to this carefully told story. If you enjoy this peaceful narration, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing where you're listening from. Your support helps us bring more stories told with kindness and calm. In the stillness of early spring 2013, the town of Norton Shores, Michigan, sat quietly by the edge of Lake Michigan. It was a community marked by modest homes, small businesses, and the steady pulse of everyday life, people who knew their neighbors, whose lives were intertwined through shared streets and familiar faces. Among them was Jessica Heeringer, a 25-year-old woman who had recently settled into the town with hopes for a fresh start. Jessica had moved here seeking stability and the chance to support herself independently. She found work at a gas station on Airline Road, a local spot frequented by travelers and residents alike. The job wasn't glamorous, late shifts, often alone, but Jessica faced it with quiet determination. Jessica's evenings were spent stocking shelves, ringing up the occasional customer, and maintaining the little store. She was known to be friendly and polite, a presence of gentle warmth in the otherwise lonely late hours. On the night of April 26th, Jessica began her shift as usual. The gas station was calm, the hum of fluorescent lights the only steady sound inside. Outside, the roads were quiet, with occasional cars passing through under the sweep of street lamps. By 11:30 p.m., Jessica was finishing her tasks, tidying the aisles and preparing to close. Surveillance footage shows her moving methodically through the store. Then, just minutes later, the camera captures a figure approaching the station, a man tall, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face. Jessica steps outside to a red Ford Mustang parked near the pumps. The man follows closely. From that moment, Jessica never returns inside. The footage ends with the station empty, the night quiet. Her family's concern grew quickly when she failed to return home. Jessica was reliable, and her absence was unusual. Friends called, hoping for a familiar voice, but the silence stretched on. Police responded swiftly. The area around the gas station was scoured for clues. Tire tracks matching the red Mustang were found near the scene. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, but few had seen anything unusual. Jessica's disappearance rippled through the community, turning quiet streets into places of unease. Vigils were held, flyers posted, and hope battled with growing fear. As the days turned to weeks, the case gained the attention of the FBI. The man on the surveillance footage remained unidentified, a ghost in the town's collective memory. Jessica's family held on to hope, even as the void grew. Her mother spoke of Jessica's kindness, her dreams, and the brightness she brought to those around her. This case was not isolated. In nearby regions, other women had vanished under similar circumstances. The pattern suggested a predator, someone patient and careful, lurking in the shadows. Psychologists involved later suggested that the perpetrator's profile matched those who targeted vulnerable individuals working alone, using isolation to his advantage. But the story remained unresolved. No ransom demands, no confirmed sightings, no trace of Jessica herself. Her disappearance left a wound not only in the lives of those who loved her, but also in the fabric of a community forced to confront its fragility. In the days following Jessica's vanishing, local law enforcement was consumed by the enormity of the search. The Michigan State Police and the FBI joined forces, pooling resources in hopes of finding clues that might lead to Jessica. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage repeatedly, zooming in on the figure who approached the gas station. His features were shadowed, but there was a determined posture to his movements, a cold, deliberate approach. The red Ford Mustang parked near the pumps became a central piece of the puzzle. Tire tracks found near the scene matched the vehicle, and investigators began tracing its ownership and movements. The Mustang itself was registered to a man named Jeffrey Willis, a local resident with a history that would soon draw attention. Jeffrey Willis was a 34-year-old construction worker living not far from Norton Shores. Initially, he denied any involvement or knowledge of Jessica's disappearance. But as police dug deeper into his background, unsettling details emerged. He had a history of erratic behavior and had been under investigation for suspected involvement in prior disappearances in the region. These suspicions had never led to charges, but they painted a picture of someone with dark tendencies lurking beneath an ordinary exterior. As detectives worked to build a timeline, they learned that Willis had been seen in the vicinity of the gas station on the night Jessica disappeared. Witnesses recalled seeing his Mustang parked nearby, its engine running silently in the night. The investigation also uncovered Willis's pattern of working alone on construction sites, often at night or in isolated areas. His acquaintances described him as quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but with bursts of anger and odd behavior that unsettled those around him. Despite mounting suspicion, Willis was careful. He left little physical evidence, and for weeks the trail remained cold. Jessica's family grew increasingly desperate, their hope fading into a dull ache. Meanwhile, the community rallied. Local volunteers joined search parties, combing fields, forests, and abandoned buildings. Flyers with Jessica's smiling face were plastered across walls and poles, a constant reminder of a missing daughter, sister, friend. Psychologists who consulted on the case noted the devastating impact of unresolved disappearance on families. The liminal space between hope and grief is uniquely painful, a waiting that drains energy and fractures certainty. Jessica's mother spoke often about this uncertainty. She recounted quiet nights filled with the echo of unanswered questions, the unbearable weight of what-ifs. Her voice remained steady but fragile, carrying the story of a mother caught between faith and fear. As the investigation progressed, forensic teams revisited old evidence with new technology. Advances in DNA analysis and trace evidence offered fresh hope. Tire marks were analyzed again. Soil samples from the Mustang's undercarriage were examined. The discovery of fiber evidence inside Willis's Mustang hinted at a struggle. Fibers that matched clothing Jessica was known to wear. This breakthrough brought renewed focus to Willis as the prime suspect. However, Willis continued to deny involvement. He was eventually arrested on unrelated charges, but no direct evidence at that time linked him conclusively to Jessica's disappearance. The police continued their work quietly, aware that many cases like this rely on patience and persistence rather than immediate breakthroughs. They reached out to communities nearby, hoping for new witnesses or tips. The wider region had seen several disappearances of women working late or in isolated conditions. Some of these cases had similarities to Jessica's, suggesting the possibility of a serial offender. Forensic psychologists explained that such offenders often select victims based on opportunity and vulnerability, exploiting moments of solitude and trust. Their ability to blend into ordinary life made them especially difficult to detect. Jessica's story resonated far beyond Norton Shores. Her disappearance highlighted the risks faced by young women in similar situations, shining a light on the need for community vigilance and improved safety measures. Throughout this period, Jessica's family became advocates for awareness. They urged communities to protect vulnerable workers and support families facing the torment of disappearance. Though the case grew colder, the persistent investigation kept Jessica's memory alive. Her name became a symbol of resilience and the ongoing quest for justice. Thank you for listening to this part of Jessica Heeringer's story. When you feel ready, say continue, and we will explore the arrest, the search for answers in the silence, and the profound effects on all those connected to this haunting case. Months passed in a quiet tension, the kind that clings to the edges of everyday life, making even the simplest moments feel fragile. The investigation into Jessica Heeringer's disappearance did not slow, though answers remained elusive. Then in late 2014, the case took a new turn that reignited hope and horror in equal measure. Jeffrey Willis was arrested on unrelated charges, a weapons violation, but during the investigation, law enforcement took the opportunity to interrogate him extensively about Jessica's disappearance. His behavior was unsettling, evasive yet oddly calm, as if weighed down by secrets he was unwilling to share. A search of Willis's property revealed items that deepened suspicion. Among them, forensic evidence linked him more strongly to the disappearance. Fibers matching Jessica's clothing, and traces of her DNA, were found in his Mustang and on tools in his possession. Despite the mounting evidence, Willis denied any involvement. His silence was as chilling as his evasion. The legal process moved forward cautiously. with prosecutors building a case based on circumstantial evidence and forensic findings. The community, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the terrifying possibility that someone living among them could be responsible for such a violent act. Fear mingled with grief, and families looked inward, reassessing their safety and trust. Jessica's family, caught in this whirlwind, faced a new battle, one against the endless waiting for closure and the grinding frustration of a slow-moving justice system. They clung to moments of hope while bracing for the weight of potential heartbreak. At the same time, investigators pursued other leads. They revisited other unsolved disappearances in the region, searching for connections that might expose a pattern or bring new victims to light. The psychological toll on everyone involved was profound. Victims' families found themselves in a limbo of unresolved grief, their pain compounded by uncertainty. Law enforcement officers wrestled with the complexity of such cases, how to find truth in shadows, how to honor the missing through relentless pursuit. In 2016, Willis faced trial for the disappearance of Jessica Heeringer. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation and sorrow. Prosecution painted a picture of a man who had used calculated control and violence to snatch Jessica from her life. Defense counsel argued the absence of a body made the case circumstantial. They suggested alternative explanations and sought to instill doubt. The jury, faced with complex forensic evidence and emotional testimony, grappled with the weight of uncertainty. Ultimately, Willis was convicted, not of murder, as Jessica's remains were never found, but on lesser charges tied to abduction and related offenses. The verdict was bittersweet, a measure of justice, but no resolution to the deepest questions. Jessica's disappearance remains officially unresolved. Her family holds on to the hope that one day, answers will come, and peace will find them. The case left a lasting imprint on Norton Shores and the surrounding communities. It sparked discussions about the vulnerabilities faced by workers alone at night, the importance of community awareness, and the persistent shadows cast by unresolved disappearances. Jessica's story is a reminder of both the fragility and strength of those touched by tragedy. The families who continue to search, the investigators who refuse to let cases grow cold, and the communities that come together in quiet remembrance. The years after Jessica's disappearance unfolded with a quiet resilience. Her family carried the weight of unanswered questions, yet they also became stewards of her memory, speaking out to keep awareness alive, and to honor her spirit. Jessica's mother, often described as both steadfast and gentle, channeled her grief into advocacy. She worked with organizations dedicated to missing persons, and helped raise funds for improved safety measures for late-shift workers. Through interviews and public appearances, she shared Jessica's story not just as a tragedy, but as a call to vigilance and compassion. The community of Norton Shores remained watchful, forever altered by the shadow of that night in 2013. The gas station where Jessica worked installed new security measures, enhanced lighting, additional cameras, and emergency alert systems, tangible efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The silence around Jessica's fate remained heavy. Despite the conviction of Jeffrey Willis on abduction charges, Jessica's whereabouts were never confirmed, and her remains never found. This absence created a void in the narrative, a haunting space where hope and despair coexist. Psychologists and victim advocates describe this kind of liminal pain as one of the most challenging forms of grief. Without closure, families live suspended between past memories and an unknown future. Each day carries the possibility of news, good or terrible, and the endurance of that tension requires extraordinary strength. Meanwhile, investigators never fully closed the file on Jessica's case. New leads and tips were periodically revisited, evidence reanalyzed with advancing forensic techniques. The search for truth continued, slow and steady, like the turn of the seasons. Jessica's story resonated beyond Norton Shores. It became a quiet reminder of the unseen dangers faced by many, and the importance of community awareness and the relentless search for justice. The case also shed light on the complexities of prosecuting crimes without a body, illuminating gaps in the system that challenge law enforcement and families alike. For those who knew Jessica, she was more than a missing person. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman with dreams and warmth, whose absence left a lasting ache. As time flows, her story reminds us of the fragility of life and the enduring need for compassion and vigilance. In the quiet town of Westfield, Massachusetts, nestled among dense woods and winding country roads, life had always moved at an unhurried pace. Small town rhythms marked by close neighbors, the changing seasons, and the soft hum of daily routines. Yet, beneath this peaceful surface, a shadow was stirring, subtle, slow, but deeply unsettling. It was the winter of 2009, when the disappearance of 19-year-old Samantha Clark unsettled the community. Samantha was a college student home for the holidays, known for her quiet smile and thoughtful nature. She had spent the evening at a local cafe with friends, laughter and warmth filling the cold air. When Samantha failed to return home that night, the initial worry was tempered by the hope she had simply stayed with friends longer than expected. But as hours passed and her phone went unanswered, concern deepened into alarm. The search began quietly, neighbors knocking on doors, friends gathering to retrace her steps. Police joined the effort, reviewing surveillance footage and speaking to those last seen with her. It was near the edge of the nearby woods that something was found, a single shoe, half buried in snow, its mate missing. The discovery sent a chill through the investigation. As days stretched into weeks, the community grappled with the reality that Samantha was gone, vanished into the cold and quiet wilderness surrounding them. Yet, the more the search expanded, the more mysterious the circumstances became. Strange symbols carved into tree bark, reports of eerie noises in the forest at night, and a growing unease that something more sinister lurked beyond the familiar paths. Samantha's case was not isolated. Similar disappearances had been whispered about for years, stories of young women drawn into the woods, never to return. Psychologists later suggested that the area's dense forest and isolation made it a dangerous place, a magnet for those with dark intent. But no one could have anticipated the truth that would emerge, a truth that would unravel the quiet town's sense of safety and challenge their understanding of darkness and human nature. As winter deepened around Westfield, the search for Samantha Clark took on a somber rhythm. Volunteers and law enforcement combed the dense woods, their breath rising in pale clouds against the sharp air. The forest, once a place of quiet beauty, now felt vast and unknowable, its shadows deeper, its paths less certain. Investigators meticulously mapped the last known movements of Samantha. She had left the cafe with a close friend around 10 p.m., their footsteps echoing softly on the icy pavement. They parted ways near the edge of town, where Samantha planned to walk home along a familiar route bordering the forest. The route was a well-worn path, lined with towering pines and skeletal branches dusted with snow. It was a path she had taken countless times, a thread connecting her to the safety of home. Yet, somewhere along that route, something shifted. Search teams found a few scattered belongings, her scarf caught on a branch, a phone battery discarded on the forest floor, its screen cracked but still faintly glowing. The presence of these items suggested a sudden disturbance, an interruption of normalcy. Among the more perplexing findings were the strange symbols etched into trees near the last place Samantha was seen. The markings were unfamiliar, jagged and seemingly ritualistic, scratches and carvings that did not align with typical graffiti or natural patterns. Local elders recalled similar marks from decades past, linked to old folklore about the whispering woods, tales of spirits and shadows that drew people away into silence. Many dismissed these as superstition, yet their reappearance alongside Samantha's disappearance stirred unease. Witnesses reported hearing odd noises at night, whispers low and indistinct, carried on the wind. Some spoke of fleeting glimpses of figures moving just beyond the tree line, elusive as mist. Despite exhaustive searches and public appeals, no clear leads emerged. The official investigation labeled Samantha's case as a missing persons file with unknown foul play, but the silence that followed was deafening. Her family held on to fragile hope, visiting the search sites, speaking her name into the stillness, as if calling her back from the unseen. Mental health professionals involved noted the toll such ambiguity takes. The lack of closure deepens trauma, creating a liminal space where grief and hope coexist uneasily. As weeks turned to months, the community grappled with fear of the unknown, of what lurked in familiar places, of the fragile boundary between safety and danger. Yet, even in darkness, threads of resilience emerged. Local groups organized night patrols, increased neighborhood watches, and held vigils to keep Samantha's memory alive. The case drew attention beyond Westfield, sparking discussions about rural disappearances and the challenges they present: vast areas, limited resources, and the quiet isolation that can mask danger. Through this, Samantha's story became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of small communities and the haunting mysteries that sometimes hide just beyond the edge of light. Months into the investigation, new pieces of the puzzle slowly emerged, though none brought the clarity everyone longed for. Instead, they deepened the mystery and revealed a complexity beneath the quiet surface of Westfield. One afternoon, a local hunter discovered a small weathered box half buried beneath a thick layer of pine needles. Inside, investigators found trinkets, buttons, a broken locket, and a worn photograph of a young woman who resembled Samantha. Alongside these were pages of handwritten notes, their ink faded and words cryptic, referencing places deep in the forest and times long past. The box was linked to a man named Harold Green, a reclusive figure who lived on the outskirts of town. Green was known for his extensive knowledge of the woods and his interest in local folklore, but few had seen him in years. When questioned, he spoke in riddles, hinting at the pull of the woods and things that cannot be tamed. While Green's evasiveness fueled speculation, no concrete evidence connected him directly to Samantha's disappearance. Yet, his presence in the story became a symbol of the forest's enigma, a place both protective and predatory. Around the same time, a pattern emerged. Other young women had vanished over the decades, their cases unsolved, their stories quietly fading from memory. Each disappearance shared eerie similarities: last seen near the woods, strange markings nearby, and no trace left behind. Psychologists examining the case suggested a possible serial offender, someone using the dense forest as a refuge, a hunting ground beyond the reach of easy detection. Law enforcement reviewed cold cases, seeking connections that might reveal a hidden predator. The town's sense of safety was fraying. Parents grew wary, community events were tinged with anxiety, and the once trusted woods became a place to avoid. Meanwhile, Samantha's family continued their search for answers. They formed a support group for families of missing persons, finding strength in shared grief and advocacy. Their efforts brought attention to the need for better resources in rural areas, more trained personnel, advanced technology, and community education. Despite advances, the case remained unresolved. No conclusive evidence emerged to pinpoint Samantha's fate. The forest kept its secrets, whispering in the wind, leaving those left behind suspended between hope and heartbreak. The psychological impact was profound. Families of the missing often experience ambiguous loss, a state where closure is denied, complicating the grieving process. For Samantha's loved ones, each day without answers was a step through a fog of uncertainty. Community members struggled with this collective trauma, seeking ways to heal while confronting the unknown. Memorials and vigils became sacred spaces, a way to honor the missing and hold on to hope. Samantha's story, while marked by disappearance and mystery, also reflected the resilience of those who refused to forget. Their quiet determination to seek truth, to keep memories alive, and to protect future generations from similar fates carried a powerful message. The years following Samantha Clark's disappearance unfolded with a quiet yet persistent heartbeat of hope and heartache. The slow passage of time did not erase the profound absence that gripped her family, friends, and the community around them. Instead, it deepened the complexity of their grief, a grief marked by the absence of answers and the persistent echo of what might have been. For Samantha's family, life became a delicate balancing act between holding on to memories and confronting the unknown. Her parents, once filled with a youthful optimism for their daughter's future, now carried a heavy, silent weight. Every holiday, birthday, and family gathering was tinged with the ghost of her missing presence. The empty chair at the dinner table was a constant reminder, yet they refused to let her memory fade into silence. Her mother, especially, became a quiet beacon of strength in the face of endless uncertainty. She transformed her grief into advocacy, partnering with local and national organizations focused on missing persons. Her voice, once soft with sorrow, grew steady and resolute as she spoke about the need for improved resources in rural investigations, the importance of community awareness, and the emotional toll ambiguous loss exacts on families. These efforts helped to bring Westfield and similar communities into focus. Conversations around rural disappearances, often overshadowed by cases in urban areas, gained traction. The challenges of investigating in remote wooded areas, sparse surveillance, difficult terrain, and fewer witnesses became central topics for law enforcement reforms and policy discussions. The community itself remained forever changed. Where once the woods had been a place of childhood adventure and quiet reflection, they had become a symbol of unease. Parents watched their children more closely, local schools implemented safety programs, and neighborhood groups organized regular patrols during dusk and nighttime hours. The fear was never loud or frantic, but a steady undercurrent, a caution woven into daily life. Despite these efforts, the mystery of Samantha's fate remained unresolved. The forest, with its whispering trees and shadowed paths, kept its secrets close. Investigators continued to revisit cold leads, leveraging advances in forensic science and technology, yet no definitive breakthrough surfaced. No remains, no clear sign of her last moments, only fragments and fleeting clues, like scattered leaves on a winter's path. This unresolved absence created a unique form of suffering known as ambiguous loss. Mental health experts explain that ambiguous loss denies closure, preventing the mourning process from fully unfolding. Families live in a suspended state, caught between hope and despair, between presence and absence. This state can lead to prolonged grief, anxiety, and a sense of living in limbo. Samantha's family and others in similar situations found solace in shared experiences. They connected with support groups, both locally and online, where understanding and empathy flowed freely. These communities became lifelines, spaces where pain could be voiced without judgment, and where the endurance of hope was honored. The mystery surrounding Samantha also brought forward reflections on human nature and the complex interplay of light and darkness in small towns. Westfield's story is not just about a disappearance, but about the vulnerabilities inherent in every community, the quiet dangers lurking beneath everyday life, and the strength found in coming together to face the unknown. The town's elders, who once shared stories of the Whispering Woods, began to tell a new narrative, one that honored the lost while urging vigilance and compassion. The folklore that once felt distant now held a poignant weight, reminding everyone that the past and present intertwine, that history can cast long shadows. In recent years, efforts to commemorate Samantha took shape. A small garden was created near the edge of the woods, where she was last seen, a place of peace, reflection and remembrance. Local artists contributed sculptures and murals, each piece imbued with quiet hope and the warmth of community care. This garden became a sanctuary, not just for Samantha's family, but for anyone touched by loss. It stands as a testament to resilience, a physical reminder that even in the face of incomprehensible absence, love and memory persist. The psychological ripples of Samantha Clark's disappearance also inspired changes within law enforcement practices in Westfield and beyond. Training programs now emphasize trauma-informed approaches to families of the missing, understanding the unique emotional needs that arise from ambiguous loss. Agencies began collaborating with mental health professionals more closely, recognizing that solving cases extends beyond forensic evidence to include care for those left behind. Samantha's story also contributed to broader discussions about rural safety. Infrastructure improvements, such as better street lighting and increased community policing in remote areas, were implemented in many towns. Technology investments, like improved cell coverage and emergency alert systems, were prioritized to reduce isolation and vulnerability. Yet, even with these advances, the human heart remains at the center of such stories. The ache of not knowing where a loved one is, or what became of them, is an enduring truth that defies statistics and procedures. It is in the silent moments, the stillness before sleep, where the loss is felt most deeply. Throughout this,
Samantha's family carried her memory with grace and tenacity. Her younger sister, inspired by the strength she witnessed, pursued studies in social work and victim advocacy, determined to make a difference for others facing similar darkness. Friends established scholarships in Samantha's name, supporting young women pursuing education and safety awareness. In the broader cultural landscape, Samantha's disappearance became part of a collective reckoning with how society addresses missing persons cases, especially those in less visible rural contexts. Documentaries, books and podcasts brought attention to the subtle patterns and systemic challenges faced by families and investigators alike. Yet, perhaps most poignantly, Samantha's story is a reminder of the fragility of life and the profound impact one absence can have on many lives. It invites reflection on our shared vulnerability and the importance of community, compassion, and persistent hope. Even now, long after the cold winter when Samantha vanished, the town of Westfield holds its breath, keeping her memory alive with gentle reverence. The woods remain, mysterious and watchful, a quiet witness to what was lost and what still lingers in the heart. In the soft glow of twilight, the whispers of the forest carry stories of love, loss, resilience, and the enduring human spirit.
The vanishing on Bitter Creek Road. Bitter Creek Road was the kind of place you only drove if you knew exactly where you were going. It was a narrow, cracked ribbon of asphalt that wound through the backcountry of Wyoming, flanked on either side by rolling hills, low sagebrush, and stretches of bare, wind-beaten land. There were no houses for miles in certain stretches, no gas stations, no well-lit intersections, just an occasional barbed wire fence, a stray cow in the wrong pasture, and the endless sky. It was February of 1982 when the first story about Bitter Creek began to circulate. At the time, the people of Sweetwater County thought it was just one of those roadside mysteries that would eventually fade into memory. But the events that unfolded would embed themselves into the town's history, a story whispered about in diners and truck stops for decades afterward. The weather that February was brutal. The wind off the plains could cut through heavy coats, and the temperature sank well below freezing at night. Truckers who passed through on Interstate 80 knew to keep their thermoses full and their tanks topped off. Bitter Creek Road, which branched away from the interstate into the emptiness, was even more dangerous. It had no streetlights, no emergency call boxes, and little traffic. On the morning of February 24, 1982, a truck driver named Mike Allen was making his usual run from Cheyenne to Salt Lake City. He'd taken Bitter Creek Road as a shortcut many times, though he knew it was risky in winter. That morning, around 8:15 a.m., something caught his eye along the side of the road. At first he thought it was a pile of discarded clothes, a blanket maybe, whipped into the ditch by the wind. But as he slowed, the colors shifted into something human. Mike pulled over, cutting the engine and stepping down into the brittle cold. The snow crunched loudly under his boots. There, lying in the shallow ditch, was a young woman. Her skin was pale, far too pale for the living, and the frost clung to her hair like fragile glass. She had no shoes. Her feet were bare, mottled with the beginnings of frostbite. Her clothes were light, a thin sweater and jeans, hardly enough for the freezing temperatures. There were marks on her wrists, faint but unmistakable, and bruising along her neck. The wind rattled through the sagebrush as Mike realized what he was looking at. He hurried back to his truck, radioing the nearest highway patrol office. Within an hour, sheriff's deputies and Wyoming Highway Patrol officers were on scene. The area was taped off, and investigators began combing the ditch and surrounding ground for any sign of what had happened. The young woman was estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old. She had dark brown hair, cut just above her shoulders, and faint freckles across her nose. No ID was found on her. No purse, no wallet, nothing that might hint at her name. The only personal item she carried was a small silver ring on her right hand, plain except for a tiny engraving inside, SL. It was immediately clear to investigators that she had not died there on her own. The lack of footprints in the snow around her body suggested she had been left there, perhaps from a passing vehicle, already deceased. Tire tracks on the shoulder were noted, though the wind quickly began to erase them.
An autopsy later confirmed what the sheriff's department had already suspected. The young woman had been strangled. There were signs she had been restrained, and evidence suggested she had been assaulted before her death. Toxicology tests revealed trace amounts of alcohol, but nothing else in her system. The time of death was placed somewhere in the early hours before dawn, maybe between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. Because she had no identification, and no one matching her description had been reported missing in the immediate area, she was classified as a Jane Doe. The local newspaper ran a small story, "Unidentified woman found on Bitter Creek Road." A black and white composite sketch was published, and truck stops along Interstate 80 were given copies. Drivers were asked to come forward if they had seen anything suspicious in the early hours of February 24th. A few tips trickled in, but nothing concrete. One trucker claimed he'd seen a young woman matching the sketch at a rest stop in Rawlins the night before. She was standing near a red semi-truck, speaking with the driver. Another caller thought they had seen her in Rock Springs 2 nights earlier, sitting alone at the counter of a diner, drinking coffee. Neither lid could be confirmed. The case might have faded into the background if not for what happened 11 months later, almost to the day. On January 29, 1983, another body was found along Interstate 80, not far from where Bitter Creek Road intersected the highway. This victim was also a young woman, similarly dressed in clothing too light for the weather, with no shoes and signs of strangulation. Like the Bitter Creek Jane Doe, she had been left near a remote roadside. The similarities between the two cases were chilling. Investigators began to suspect they were dealing with a serial predator targeting young women in the sparsely populated stretches of Wyoming and Utah. But without names for the victims, and with few witnesses, the investigation moved slowly. It would be decades before the woman found on Bitter Creek Road had a name. In the meantime, her case became one of the region's most unsettling mysteries, a reminder of how easily a person could vanish in the vast emptiness of the high plains. For the people who drove that road, especially in the dark hours before dawn, there was always a sense of unease. The wind seemed sharper there, the shadows deeper. Some swore they could feel eyes on them when they slowed, near the spot where she had been found. Others claimed they had seen a figure on the shoulder at night, only to realize as they passed that no one was there. The official investigation never closed. Detectives kept her photo on their desks, and truckers continued to share the story among themselves, a warning to stay alert, to watch for those who might be wandering the rest stops alone. But for years Bitter Creek kept its secret. What no one could have predicted then was how the truth, when it finally emerged, would be darker and stranger than anyone had guessed. By the winter of 1983, the Wyoming Highway Patrol and Sweetwater County Sheriff's Office had a grim suspicion. The young woman found along Bitter Creek Road the previous February had not been an isolated case. The similarities between her death and the January 1983 roadside discovery near the I-80 interchange were hard to ignore. Both victims were young women. Both had been strangled. Both were barefoot, wearing clothing far too light for Wyoming's winter. Neither had been identified at the time of discovery, and in both cases, their bodies had been left in remote areas where the killer could be almost certain they wouldn't be found immediately. The crime scenes offered frustratingly little. In the early 1980s, forensic technology was still limited. DNA testing wasn't yet a routine tool, and the best the state crime lab could do was compare fibers, tire impressions and fingerprints, if they had them. In both cases, there were tire tracks, but the snow and wind erased detail quickly. Investigators noted they could belong to a heavy truck, maybe a semi, but they couldn't be sure. It wasn't lost on detectives that both women had last been seen, at least according to truck stop chatter, near long-haul truckers. That detail began to shape the early theory. The killer might be a truck driver, using the constant movement and anonymity of the job to his advantage. Interstate 80 in the early 80s was a lifeline for commerce, but also a kind of shadow world. Truck stops were open all night, buzzing with tired drivers, transient workers, and the occasional hitchhiker trying to get to the next town. In Rawlins, Rock Springs and Evanston, rest areas saw a steady flow of young women, some traveling, some running from bad situations, Others simply stranded after a ride fell through. The trucking community was tight-knit, but not so tight that strangers didn't blend in. Detectives began quietly visiting truck stops up and down the interstate, speaking to anyone who might remember a young brunette with shoulder-length hair and a plain silver ring. A few swore they'd seen her. One waitress at a Rock Springs diner recalled her vividly. She came in real late, maybe close to midnight, the waitress told them. Ordered coffee and a piece of pie. Didn't have much to say. She kept glancing toward the parking lot like she was waiting for someone. Then a guy came in. Tall, with a beard, wearing a trucker's cap. They talked for maybe 5 minutes, then left together. The waitress couldn't remember exactly when she'd seen them, whether it had been the night before the body was found, or a few nights earlier, but her description of the man was filed away. The second woman, found near the I-80 interchange in January 1983, became known as I-80 Jane Doe. Like the Bitter Creek victim, she was never reported missing in the local area, leading investigators to believe both women may have been from out of state. In April 1983, Wyoming authorities were contacted by Utah police about a case from late 1982. A young woman had been found near a rest area outside Wendover, Utah, along the same stretch of interstate. Her cause of death was also strangulation, and she had been left without shoes. 3 women, all found within 150 miles of each other, all with similar wounds, all barefoot. The pattern was disturbing, but without names for the victims, the investigation had no solid anchor. It was as though these women had been plucked from nowhere and erased, their identities disappearing as completely as their lives. Sheriff's investigator Wayne Parker was one of the lead detectives on the Bitter Creek case. He kept the composite sketch on his desk, staring at it between calls. He knew from experience that the anonymity of the victim was a major hurdle. Without a name, it was nearly impossible to build a picture of her life, her routines and her final days. Parker began contacting missing persons units in neighboring states, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, even as far as Oregon. He mailed the composite sketch and the description: female, approximately 18-25 years old, 5'5", around 120 pounds, dark brown hair, shoulder length, brown eyes, freckles across the nose, wearing a light sweater, jeans, silver ring on right hand engraving SL inside. Weeks passed. Some states sent lists of missing women, but none matched. The silver ring's engraving became a fixation. SL could be initials, or it could mean something else entirely. When asked, a jeweler in Rock Springs suggested it might have been a gift, perhaps from someone with those initials. In late summer 1983, a truck driver named Dennis Keaton called in a tip. He had been at the Little America truck stop west of Green River in February '82, just days before the Bitter Creek Jane Doe was found. He remembered seeing a young woman matching her description. She looked cold, he told detectives. Didn't have much on. She was walking between trucks, like she was asking for rides. Keaton said he saw her climb into a red Peterbilt truck with white stripes. The driver, he remembered, was middle-aged, stocky, wearing a flannel shirt. He didn't get the truck's number or license plate. In that world, people rarely did. Detectives cross-referenced the detail with the earlier Rawlins sighting, where a waitress had also mentioned a man in a trucker's cap. It was hardly enough to make an arrest, but it was the first time they had a consistent vehicle description. By early 1984, the investigation into Bitter Creek Jane Doe had slowed. The sheriff's office still took occasional calls, but without forensic breakthroughs, the leads kept drying up. Then on March 6, 1984, a call came in from Wyoming Highway Patrol. Another body had been found, this time near the outskirts of Cheyenne, off an isolated service road. The victim was a young woman, barefoot, with signs of strangulation. The similarities to the previous cases were too close to ignore. Now there were at least 4 women, spanning 3 winters. The Wyoming and Utah cases began to be referred to, quietly, as the Interstate 80 murders. Rumors spread quickly among truckers and locals alike. Some believed the killer was still out there, traveling the interstate under everyone's noses. Others claimed the murders had stopped after 1984 because the killer had been caught for some other crime, locked away under a different charge. But for the families of the unidentified, there was no closure. Despite the lack of progress, some deputies couldn't shake the feeling that Bitter Creek Road itself held meaning. Perhaps the killer knew the area, knew it was quiet enough for a dump site, but close enough to the interstate for a quick escape. Older ranchers in the area told investigators that they had seen strange vehicles parked along the road at night in the early 80s, mostly trucks, sometimes vans. When asked if they'd reported it at the time, most admitted they hadn't. Out there, people minded their own business. Wayne Parker found himself driving the road alone one night in early spring 1984, parking at the spot where she'd been found. He sat with the engine off, the silence so deep he could hear the ticking of the cooling metal. The sagebrush whispered in the wind. It wasn't hard to imagine headlights cresting the hill, a truck slowing just enough to push open a passenger side door. It was there, Parker later admitted, that the case stopped being just another file on his desk. He wanted her name. By the late 1980s, Bitter Creek Jane Doe's case had gone cold. It was still open, but there were no active leads. Her body had been buried in a local cemetery under a simple marker reading Jane Doe, found February 24, 1982. In the years that followed, technology began to catch up. DNA databases started to emerge. The idea of genetic genealogy was still far off, but detectives began holding on to samples in the hope that one day, the science would be ready. Meanwhile, more stories surfaced, whispers of similar murders along other interstates, cases that bore eerie similarities, but spanned multiple states and decades. Whether they were connected to the Bitter Creek case was impossible to say. It wasn't until the 2010s, decades later, that a break would come. But when it did, it would force investigators to revisit every detail of those winter nights, and reveal that the truth was more tangled and far-reaching than they had imagined. The winter of 1992 lingered longer than usual in Wyoming's high plains, holding the land in a quiet icy grip. The Bitter Creek area, remote, windswept and bordered by rugged hills, remained a lonely stretch of America's backbone, a place where the wind could carry a voice for miles but still no one would hear it. By then, the murder that would come to be known as the Bitter Creek case had moved from shock to a chilling kind of obsession for investigators. They had a body, a timeline and a scattering of clues, but the identity of the young woman found in that desolate roadside ditch was still unknown. Months had passed since her discovery, and yet the forensic evidence provided few answers. The autopsy revealed details that stayed with the team: bruising on her arms and torso, ligature marks that hinted at a prolonged restraint, and the unmistakable signs of strangulation. She had fought, but her killer had been methodical. Toxicology showed trace amounts of drugs in her system, enough to suggest she had been subdued before her death. This pointed to someone experienced, someone who had done this before or at least planned it well. The most haunting detail was her appearance. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with light brown hair that had been recently washed. Her nails were manicured, but her clothing told another story: a thin sweatshirt and jeans ill-suited to the frigid weather, almost as though she had been dressed hurriedly, or dressed by someone else after death. Detectives canvassed the nearby towns, Rock Springs, Green River and Evanston, showing composite sketches to truck stops, diners and bars that lined the I-80 corridor. This was trucker country, and transient faces came and went daily. Some recalled seeing a woman matching her description near the Little America truck stop a few weeks earlier. Others mentioned a dark semi, with a blue cab and silver stripes, parked for long hours in the same area. But no one could offer a name. Investigators began to suspect that her killer might be a long-haul truck driver, someone with the ability to travel quickly between states, someone who could abduct and dispose of a victim in remote areas without drawing attention. This theory, grim as it was, had weight. By the early 90s. The FBI and several state agencies had started to notice a troubling pattern of murdered women found near highways, many of them unidentified, many of them likely involved in vulnerable lifestyles such as hitchhiking or sex work. The woman from Bitter Creek fit into that pattern, though nothing about her was certain yet. Her face was sent to national databases, and her dental records, though limited, were cross-referenced with missing persons reports from across the country. Dozens of families came forward, desperate to know if the Jane Doe might be their daughter or sister. Each time, DNA or dental comparisons ruled them out, and each time the case seemed to grow heavier on the investigators who carried it. One detective in particular, a veteran named John Cowley, took the case personally. He had walked the crime scene himself that first morning, standing over the young woman's body as the wind pushed sand across the frozen ground. He couldn't stop thinking about the vulnerability it took for someone to end up here, far from any home, abandoned in an unforgiving place. Cowley pushed for more forensic testing, though at the time, DNA technology was still in its infancy. The results were minimal, a partial profile, male but not enough for a database hit. As winter turned to spring, Cowley and the team broadened their search radius. They spoke to law enforcement agencies in Utah, Colorado, Nebraska, anywhere reachable by a day's drive from the scene. They compared notes on other unsolved murders, looking for overlaps in method or victim type. It was during one of these exchanges that they learned about another Jane Doe, found a year earlier in Sheridan County, Wyoming, also near a highway, also strangled, and also unidentified. The similarities were chilling, but the two cases couldn't be directly linked. Still, the possibility of a serial offender traveling through the state began to harden into a likelihood. While the investigation pressed on, life in Sweetwater County resumed its slow rhythm, though residents were more cautious now. Women avoided hitchhiking, and truckers, many of whom took pride in their reputation for helping stranded motorists, found themselves viewed with suspicion. The local papers ran occasional updates, often accompanied by that same sketch of the unidentified woman, her eyes rendered in soft pencil lines, staring out from above a caption that read simply, "WHO as she." In the quiet hours, Cowley sometimes visited the site where she had been found. The earth there had long since been disturbed and recovered, but he felt the need to stand on that stretch of highway shoulder, to remember exactly what it looked like, the angle of the slope, the way the wind curled around the embankment. He believed in staying connected to the scene, in not letting the details fade. One small lead emerged in the summer of 1992, when a waitress in Rawlins contacted police. She claimed to have served a young woman fitting the Jane Doe's description, just days before the estimated date of death. The woman had been with a man in his 40s, heavy-set, wearing a trucker's cap. They seemed tense. She spoke little, while he kept glancing toward the door. The waitress remembered the name embroidered on his jacket. It wasn't much, but in a case starved for leads, it was something. Detectives checked trucking company records, narrowed down possible pulls who had been in the area, and ran background checks. A few names stood out: men with prior arrests for assault, men known to travel the I-80 route regularly, but each was either eliminated by alibi or lack of evidence. The trail went cold again. The months slipped into years. Other cases came and went, but the Bitter Creek Jane Doe never left the desks of the detectives who had worked her file. When advances in DNA testing became available in the late 90s, her evidence was resubmitted. The partial profile remained partial, but the technology revealed another piece: male DNA mixed with a trace of an unknown female's. It was impossible to say if the second profile belonged to a victim, an accomplice, or simply contamination. By the early 2000s, the case was folded into a larger federal project, aimed at identifying victims along major trucking routes. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative began sharing intelligence between states, connecting murders and disappearances that had once seemed isolated. In this new context, the Bitter Creek Jane Doe looked less like an anomaly, and more like a grim part of a larger pattern, a network of crimes committed by men who knew the roads better than anyone, who could vanish into them as easily as they appeared. For Cowley, now nearing retirement, the frustration was in knowing that somewhere out there was a name, 2 names in fact. One for the woman who had died, and one for the man who had taken her life. Both were hidden in the noise of countless data points, waiting for the right piece to bring them into focus. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned a pale silver, Cowley would drive the length of the highway, where she'd been found. The wind still carried the same dry, cutting scent of sage and dust. It was a lonely place, but he told himself she deserved to be remembered here, where her last moments had been spent. That year, 2003, brought a small spark of hope. New composite imaging technology allowed the reconstruction of her likely appearance in color, giving her a face that was more than a pencil sketch. The image was distributed online, in newspapers, and on television segments. Dozens of new tips came in, but as before, each lead fell away under scrutiny. The Bitter Creek Jane Doe remained just that, a name borrowed from the land where she was found, the only identity that time and circumstance had allowed her. And though the years were unkind to evidence, there was still a lingering sense among the investigative team that her story wasn't finished, that the truth was still somewhere out there, waiting to be uncovered. It was a belief that would be tested in the years to come, as the case crossed into a new era of investigation, one where science, persistence, and a little bit of luck might finally pull her from the shadows. In the months after the press conferences announcing the identification of the Bitter Creek Betty and I-90 Jane Doe victims, the investigation shifted from one focus solely on the past, into an active search for justice. The work of unmasking the man responsible, finally giving him a name, became the central goal for both law enforcement and the families who had endured decades of unanswered questions. With the victims now known, Lisa Kimmel, Wendy Stevens and several others tied by DNA and circumstance, the web of the case was clearer. Investigators had linked multiple murder scenes across Wyoming and Montana, stretching into other states. The time span was chilling, nearly a decade of killings, some taking place within weeks of each other, others separated by years of silence. It became evident that the man who left those women along isolated highways was not impulsive. He was calculating, opportunistic and chillingly patient. The DNA profile recovered from the bodies had long been stored in national databases, waiting for a match. For years there had been none, but with the rise of forensic genealogy, using public ancestry databases to trace family lines, investigators had a new tool. In 2020, a small team of genealogists and detectives began quietly working the profile. They traced distant cousins, built sprawling family trees, and identified potential suspects based on geography, age, and opportunity. By late 2021, a name began to emerge from the data, a truck driver who had spent decades hauling freight along I-80 and I-90, often through Wyoming's remote corridors. He had no major criminal record, just minor infractions, but his roots, his work history, and his time away from home aligned eerily with the dates and locations of the murders. Undercover surveillance began. Investigators collected his discarded items, coffee cups, cigarette butts, fast food wrappers from truck stops. The DNA from those items matched the profile from Bitter Creek Betty and I-90 Jane Doe. It was the break the case had needed for more than 30 years. When the arrest came, it was quiet. The man, now in his early 60s, was taken into custody, without resistance, in a grocery store parking lot. Neighbors in his small town were shocked. They described him as friendly, reserved, the sort who kept his lawn neat and waved to passers-by. No one imagined that the man they saw at the gas station, or in the post office, had carried the weight of so many secrets. The interrogation revealed little. He denied involvement, claiming he had never harmed anyone, but the science was unshakable. The DNA was there, and so were the corroborating details, witness statements from decades earlier, sightings of his truck, receipts placing him in towns near the crime scenes. For the families, the arrest brought a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that the faceless predator was finally named, grief that it had taken so long that the women they loved were not alive to see justice. Many spoke of the cruel math of time, the years that had passed, The milestones missed, the voices they could only remember, never hear again. In Riverton, Wyoming, a memorial was held for all the women believed to be linked to the case. It was an overcast day, the wind tugging at flowers, laid out along the base of a stone monument, etched with names. Some of the names were only recently added, others had been there for years. As the ceremony unfolded, people told stories, not just of the victims' final days, but of their laughter, their quirks, the lives they'd been building before someone ended them. The trial was scheduled for the following year, but it was already clear that many of the families would not get the answers they wanted. The killer was not talking. Without a confession, the timeline of his crimes, the details of his methods, and the identities of all his possible victims would remain incomplete. Law enforcement suspected there were more, perhaps women never found, or whose deaths had been misclassified as accidents or runaways. One detective, reflecting on the investigation, said that what haunted him most was the idea of the long stretches between murders. He could stop for months, years, even, and pick up again like nothing had happened. It's not just that he killed, it's that he could live among people, hold a job, have neighbors, all while knowing what he'd done. That's a kind of darkness most people can't imagine. The geographical nature of his work as a trucker explained the difficulty in catching him. He was never in one place long enough to draw suspicion. He could travel hundreds of miles between victims, cross state lines that complicated jurisdiction, and strike in places where strangers were common. The highways became both his hunting ground and his escape route. For the families, closure was an imperfect concept. Some found comfort in seeing the man in custody, in knowing his days of freedom were over. Others felt the absence of a true reckoning, no remorse, no explanations. They were left with the ache of unanswerable questions. In the weeks after the arrest, Bitter Creek itself became a place of pilgrimage for some. It was there, along that lonely stretch of land, that one of the victims had been left, her life reduced to a set of forensic markers, until her name was restored. Visitors left wildflowers at the roadside. Some simply stood in silence, listening to the wind move over the open plain, imagining the cold and isolation the women must have felt in their final moments. Local historians began documenting the case in detail, preserving it not just as a crime story, but as part of Wyoming's history, a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of isolated places and the persistence of those seeking justice.
Even now, the full scope of the killer's actions may never be known, but the story of Bitter Creek Betty and I-90 Jane Doe is no longer about nameless victims. Their identities, their lives, and their families have reclaimed space in the narrative, and in doing so, they have denied the killer one of his cruelest victories, the ability to erase. When the trial begins, the courtroom will hold not just the accused and the legal teams, but decades of memory and grief. It will hold the mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends who carried photographs in wallets, who kept bedroom doors closed for years, who lit candles on birthdays and anniversaries. The winds across the Wyoming plains will keep blowing, unbothered by the passing of time, but in the towns and cities touched by this case, the names will be spoken, the stories told. And perhaps, in that continued telling, there is a kind of justice that the law alone can't deliver. The Bitter Creek case, in its long arc from anonymity to identification, from uncertainty to partial justice, is a reminder of the endurance required in the face of silence. The people who pursued answers never stopped, not in the quiet years, not in the frustrating dead ends. They held on until the technology, the timing, and the tenacity aligned. And though there is still more to uncover, there is one undeniable truth. The women whose lives were stolen are no longer lost to time. They are remembered, they are named, and they have at last been found. On the evening of February 9th, 2004, in the snowy hills of northern New Hampshire, a young woman named Maura Murray vanished from the side of a quiet rural road. The days that followed brought a swirl of questions, theories, and whispered suspicions that have persisted for 2 decades. What happened to Maura has never been conclusively answered, and the case continues to haunt those who knew her and countless strangers who've been drawn into the mystery. Maura was 21 years old, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She was bright, athletic, and capable, but also private and reserved. Those who knew her often said she was hard to read, not unfriendly, but guarded. Her life in early February seemed busy but ordinary. She was juggling classes, clinical nursing shifts, and time with friends and her boyfriend, Bill Rausch, who was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. On the Thursday before she disappeared, something unusual happened at her campus job. Maura worked security at a dorm building, checking IDs and monitoring visitors. That night, she took a phone call from her sister Kathleen. The details of the conversation have never been fully confirmed, but it's believed Kathleen told her about a personal problem, something to do with alcohol and a strained relationship. Whatever was said, it deeply upset Maura. A supervisor noticed she was distraught and escorted her back to her dorm. She reportedly cried uncontrollably for a long time. By Monday, February 9th, her mood seemed different, but no one knew exactly what she was planning. Around midday, Maura sent emails to her professors saying there had been a death in the family and she would be out for the week. There was no death in the family, a detail that later puzzled investigators. She then called a lodging service in Vermont, inquiring about booking a room. That call, too, raised questions. She packed her car, a black 1996 Saturn sedan, with clothes, toiletries, textbooks, and a box of wine. She withdrew $280 in cash from an ATM and bought alcohol at a liquor store, including a bottle of Kahlua and some Bailey's Irish Cream. Then in the early afternoon, she drove north out of Amherst. Her exact destination has never been known. Around 7:27 p.m., in the small town of Haverhill, New Hampshire, a local woman heard a thud outside her home. Looking out, she saw a car off the road, its front end in a snowbank. The car's lights were on, and she could see a young woman moving around outside. This neighbor called the police. Another neighbor, Butch Atwood, a school bus driver, stopped to ask if the driver, Maura, needed help. She told him no, she'd already called roadside assistance. Atwood knew there was no cell service in the area and found her response odd, but he didn't push. He went home and called the police himself. When officers arrived at 7:46 p.m., Maura was gone. The Saturn was locked. Inside were her packed belongings, the alcohol, and a box of Franzia wine that had spilled in the back seat. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the car, other than a few in the snow nearby, and no sign of where she'd gone. The temperature was around 28 degrees that night, and snow was falling lightly. It was not the kind of night anyone could walk far without being noticed, and yet Maura had vanished. The first hours of the search were strange. Local police checked the area, including nearby houses and wooded trails. State police became involved the next day. A tracking dog followed her scent for about 100 yards east from the car, then lost it abruptly in the middle of the road, suggesting she may have been picked up by another vehicle. Her family was called, and within days her father Fred Murray arrived, exhausted and desperate for answers. He believed, and still believes, that Maura met with foul play. From the beginning, speculation flourished. Some believed she had staged her disappearance to start a new life, pointing to the email about a fake family death and her drive north. Others suspected suicide, but most, including Fred Murray, were certain that someone had picked her up and harmed her. In the weeks after, searches covered miles of wooded terrain, rivers and back roads. Volunteers combed the area on foot, horseback, and with dogs. Helicopters scanned from above. Nothing. Theories multiplied online, where amateur sleuths dissected every detail. Some tied her disappearance to later cases of missing women in the region. Others wondered if she'd been fleeing a personal crisis, or if she'd been involved in a hit-and-run days earlier and feared legal trouble. But with no witnesses beyond the neighbors, and no confirmed sightings after she left the crash site, the trail went cold almost immediately. As winter turned to spring, the snow melted away, but Maura's absence lingered. Her family continued to come back to New Hampshire,
handing out flyers, knocking on doors, and urging anyone with information to come forward. Over time, the case became one of the most widely discussed missing persons stories in America, not because of its violence, but because of its sheer aching uncertainty. The snow along Route 112 had been pushed into dull, icy ridges by the plows, but the air that evening carried an unusual stillness. It was the kind of stillness that felt aware, as if the landscape itself was watching. Mora's Saturn sat at an awkward angle, nose pointed slightly toward a snowbank, its rear end jutting into the lane. The windshield was intact. The airbags had deployed. The driver's side door was closed, the passenger door ajar by less than an inch. The first person to stop was a local woman named Faith Westman, whose home overlooked a portion of the road. She had glanced out her window around 7:27 p.m. and noticed the strange positioning of the vehicle. Concerned, she dialed the local police to report a possible accident. She didn't recall seeing another car nearby. She didn't see anyone injured, but she thought she saw a lone figure moving around the car. A passing school bus driver named Butch Atwood also noticed the Saturn. He pulled over and rolled down his window, asking if the driver needed help. The young woman standing near the car was wearing a dark coat and appeared cold. She insisted she was fine, saying she had already called AAA. Atwood found this odd. Cell reception in the area was notoriously unreliable, and he didn't recall seeing her on a phone. Still, he took her at her word and drove on, deciding to phone the police himself once he reached home. By the time the first officer, Cecil Smith, arrived at 7:46 p.m., Mora was gone. Her footprints led away from the car, then vanished in the snow. There were no signs of a struggle in the immediate area, no indication that another vehicle had stopped to pick her up. Her purse, credit cards, and cell phone were missing. The Saturn's interior smelled faintly of alcohol, and in the back seat sat an empty soda bottle that smelled of liquor. The police found a small amount of red wine spilled on the car's door and seat, but there was no blood to suggest serious injury. In the trunk, they discovered a box of Franzia wine, a few personal belongings, and a scrubbing pad used for cleaning windshields. The front of the car showed minor damage, consistent with hitting a snowbank or spinning into the berm, not a high-speed crash. As the hours passed and darkness deepened, the search widened. The air temperature had dropped sharply. Anyone outside without proper gear was at risk for hypothermia. Officers walked the roadside with flashlights, peering into the woods that bordered the narrow highway. The beam of each light caught only the trunks of bare trees and the glitter of snow. The following morning, search dogs were brought in. One dog followed a scent trail from the Saturn east down Route 112 for about 100 yards before it abruptly stopped, as if the scent had been lifted into a vehicle. That possibility troubled investigators. It suggested she might have been picked up, whether voluntarily or not. Mora's family was notified, and her father, Fred, drove up from Massachusetts almost immediately. He'd last seen her just the weekend before. They had spent Sunday together shopping for a used car, and she'd seemed quiet, a little distracted, but nothing he considered alarming. Now, with her missing, every small moment from that day seemed freighted with meaning. Police soon pieced together her movements in the days leading to the crash. On the evening of February 5th, just 3 days earlier, Mora had been working her shift at the UMass Amherst campus security desk, when she received a phone call that upset her so much she broke down in tears. The details of that call remain unclear. No one has publicly identified the caller. Her supervisor had escorted her back to her dorm, concerned for her emotional state. The day before she vanished, Mora emailed her professors to say there had been a death in her family and that she would be away for a week. There had been no such death. Instead, she had packed up some of her belongings, textbooks, toiletries, clothes, and withdrawn almost $280 from her bank account. She stopped at an ATM, then purchased alcohol from a local liquor store, a box of wine, a bottle of Kahlua, and a small amount of vodka. Investigators considered various possibilities. Was she planning a trip, a visit to friends, or something more final. The route she took north was puzzling. Her destination was unknown, though some speculated she was heading to the White Mountains, an area she loved. Maura had visited there before, with family and friends, and in her room, police found printed directions to Burlington, Vermont. Theories bloomed in the wake of her disappearance. Some suggested she had wanted to escape, leave behind school, obligations, and whatever was troubling her. Others feared she'd been abducted. The dog's halted scent trail supported the idea that another person had been involved. Fred Murray was unsparing in his criticism of the early investigation. He believed the search that first night was too limited, that precious time was lost before a wider net was cast. To him, it was inconceivable that his daughter, a resourceful and intelligent young woman, would simply wander off into the freezing woods. Locals in Haverhill recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area that evening. One person mentioned a dark pickup truck idling on a side road. Another claimed to have seen a man walking along the shoulder, not far from where Maura's car was found. But none of these sightings could be verified. As days turned into weeks, the case drew more attention from the media. Amateur sleuths, online forums, and bloggers began poring over every detail, speculating about Maura's mental state, her relationships, and the possible significance of her planned trip. The quiet road where the Saturn was found became a focal point for those seeking answers. For those closest to Maura, the theories were painful. Her sister Kathleen and her brother spoke of her as someone fiercely independent but deeply connected to her family. They described her as someone who could be both private and warm, who loved running, hiking, and the satisfaction of a long uphill climb. That such a person could vanish without leaving a clear trace felt impossible to accept. The environment itself seemed complicit in the mystery. The White Mountains and the remote stretches of rural New Hampshire offered endless places to disappear: dense forests, frozen rivers, abandoned trails that twisted away into unmarked wilderness. Any wrong turn in such conditions could prove fatal. In the weeks after her disappearance, law enforcement scoured nearby rivers with divers, searched cabins, and questioned anyone who might have picked her up. They combed through phone records, ATM withdrawals, and internet searches, but each lead either dead-ended or unraveled into conflicting accounts. Maura's father maintained that she was likely the victim of foul play. He believed she had been on her way to clear her head, perhaps to a favorite hiking spot, when she encountered the wrong person at the wrong time. His frustration with the investigation grew, and he began organizing his own searches, enlisting volunteers to walk the woods and back roads. What made the case more haunting was the absence of closure. No body, no confirmed sighting, no final message. Each piece of evidence felt like it pointed in multiple directions at once, a puzzle whose edges refused to meet. By March, snowmelt revealed nothing new. Spring crept into the mountains, softening the icy ridges along Route 112, but the Saturn remained in the impound lot, mute and unyielding. And somewhere beyond the neatly plowed edges of the road, the unanswered question lingered, heavy in the air. What happened to Maura Murray in those few quiet minutes before the world noticed she was gone? On the third day after Maura Murray vanished, the quiet stretch of Route 112, near the small New Hampshire town of Woodsville, looked much the same as it had on the night she disappeared. The weather was still bitterly cold, the trees lining the road were bare and unmoving, and the snowbanks, stained grey by passing cars, loomed high along the shoulder. But now, instead of the flicker of police lights and the sound of officers' boots crunching over ice, there was a strange stillness, an absence that made the road feel heavier somehow. The search efforts had slowed, but they had not stopped. Volunteer teams, along with police and fire crews, were still combing the wooded areas and frozen fields surrounding the curve where Maura's Saturn had been found. The car itself had been towed away, taken to a secure facility, where investigators were hoping to find some overlooked clue, something as small as a partial fingerprint, or a scrap of fabric, that might explain why a young woman had left her life in Massachusetts only to vanish in the mountains. Maura's family remained in the area, checking into a small motel near the center of town. Her father, Fred, had spent most of his waking hours walking the roads and knocking on doors, speaking to anyone who might have seen her or something unusual that night. The locals, many of whom had already been questioned by police, still opened their doors to him. Some offered coffee or directions, some gave him false hope in the form of vague sightings, shadows near a river, a woman walking quickly in the snow, a flash of dark hair disappearing into the trees. None of it ever led anywhere solid. The weeks after the disappearance blurred together. Police statements to the press were careful, almost frustratingly vague. They confirmed that Maura had emailed her professors before leaving campus, telling them she'd be gone for a week due to a family emergency. That emergency didn't exist. She had also packed some belongings into her car, along with alcohol and a box of wine, and driven north without telling her family. The purpose of her trip remained a mystery, one that seemed more troubling the longer she stayed missing. In the absence of answers, speculation began to seep into the narrative, small-town gossip mixed with online theories, and soon Maura's disappearance became something much larger, an unsolved puzzle that drew strangers from far beyond New Hampshire. Some thought she had planned her own disappearance. Others believed she had met with foul play, possibly from someone who had spotted her vulnerable and alone on that icy stretch of road. Her boyfriend, Billy, stationed at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, had been notified quickly after she vanished. He flew to New Hampshire almost immediately, and his grief was complicated. He was clearly desperate to find her, but there were unspoken tensions. They'd been going through a difficult time, and Maura had been exchanging messages with another man. Friends of hers had described her as feeling trapped in the days before she left, but no one could agree on exactly what she'd been running from. Search dogs had followed a faint scent trail from the spot where Maura's car had been abandoned, leading about 100 feet east along the road before it vanished abruptly. The working theory was that she may have gotten into another vehicle, voluntarily or not. But if someone had picked her up, they had done so without being noticed by the neighbors who lived nearby. Fred, meanwhile, refused to entertain the idea that she had run away. He insisted to reporters that Maura must have been abducted, perhaps by someone who knew the area well enough to make her vanish without a trace. He gave interviews with tired eyes, and a voice edged with quiet anger, urging anyone who might have seen something, anything, to come forward. The search stretched into deeper winter. Snow fell steadily in the weeks following her disappearance, erasing potential evidence. The woods surrounding the road were treacherous in that kind of weather. Streams were frozen over, trails were concealed by drifts, and daylight hours were short. Still, searchers pressed on. They brought in cadaver dogs, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, and dive teams to explore nearby bodies of water. All of it ended the same way, without a sign of Maura. Her dorm room at UMass Amherst was searched, but nothing inside provided a definitive answer. There were no clear notes of intention, no obvious hints about her plans. Only a few personal items were missing, suggesting she had packed lightly. Her cell phone and bank accounts showed no activity after the night she vanished, something investigators described as unusual for a young woman her age in 2004. The mystery began to consume the community. Locals who had barely spoken to each other in years found themselves comparing what they remembered from that night, whether they'd seen an unfamiliar car or noticed footprints along the edge of the woods. One neighbor recalled hearing something that could have been a car door slamming, but couldn't be sure. Another thought they saw movement on the side of the road, but assumed it was an animal. By the time the case reached the 1-month mark, it had gained national attention. Reporters and documentary crews began to show up, their cameras pointed at the quiet town and the frozen road where her car had been found. Some residents welcomed the attention, believing that any publicity might help uncover the truth. Others resented it, feeling as though their home was being turned into the setting for a morbid television drama. For Fred, there was no such thing as too much attention. He believed that someone, somewhere knew what had happened, and that keeping Mora's name in the headlines was the only way to force that truth into the open. He held on to the hope that she might still be alive, though each passing day made that hope harder to maintain. As winter slowly began to thaw, the search shifted. Investigators began retracing Mora's movements in the days leading up to her disappearance. They looked into her internet searches, her phone calls, and the transactions she'd made before leaving Amherst. They interviewed her friends again, probing for details that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but could now shed light on her state of mind. One detail that surfaced was her request for information about renting a condominium in the White Mountains. It wasn't clear if she had intended to meet someone there, or simply wanted time alone. Some friends believed she had been under intense stress, balancing school, work and personal issues, and that she might have sought a break from her life. But that theory didn't explain why she had chosen such a remote, dangerous place in the dead of winter. Fred continued to search the woods himself, often accompanied by volunteers. He would return to the same locations over and over, convinced that she might be somewhere nearby, just beyond the reach of previous searches. Each time he returned empty-handed, the frustration deepened. In the midst of all this, there were false alarms, calls from people claiming to have seen her, tips that led investigators down long empty roads, reports of a woman matching her description walking along highways in distant states. None of them ever panned out. By spring, the case had reached a grim plateau. No physical evidence, no confirmed sightings, no breakthroughs, just the same cold stretch of road in New Hampshire, the same questions, and the same silence that had greeted searchers on that first frozen night. If Mora had chosen to disappear, she had done it with a precision and permanence that was rare. If she had met with foul play, the person responsible had left behind nothing, not even a trace to suggest which way she had gone when she stepped away from her car. And so, in the absence of answers, the mystery only deepened, becoming less a single case, and more an enduring ghost story that hung over the region. The search for Mora Murray stretched on in the days following her disappearance, but as winter tightened its grip on the White Mountains, the landscape seemed to conspire against those trying to find her. Snow fell almost daily, covering footprints and washing away any faint traces of her passage. For her family, the relentless cold was a reminder that every passing hour diminished the chances of finding her alive. Fred Murray, her father, refused to return home for long stretches, staying in motels and driving up and down Route 112, stopping to knock on doors and hand out flyers. His face became familiar to the locals, some of whom quietly avoided him, not wanting to be reminded of the tragedy that had unfolded practically in their backyard. Others offered coffee, sympathy and vague recollections, a woman walking alone, a shadow moving between trees, but nothing that could be pinned down. In the weeks that followed, the case attracted a swirl of rumors. Some claimed to have seen Mora at a local convenience store, days after she vanished, disoriented but alive. Others whispered she had slipped into the woods intentionally, seeking to escape a life that had begun to feel unbearable. A few were convinced she had been taken by someone who knew the area well, someone who could move unseen in the thick forests and narrow dirt roads. The sheer number of theories became its own kind of noise, drowning out the facts investigators were trying to piece together. In the middle of February, the search effort was scaled back. State police had brought in helicopters, scent dogs, and even heat-detecting equipment, but the snow made everything more difficult. The dogs lost her scent within a short distance from the crash site, as though she had simply vanished into the cold night air. No dropped belongings, no footprints leading to safety, no clear sign of a struggle, just emptiness. The family could not let go. They organized their own volunteer search parties, scouring abandoned cabins, walking along frozen riverbanks, and even checking old wells. Each day ended in disappointment. As March came and the snow began to thaw in patches, hopes rose briefly that melting ice might reveal something, but the landscape gave nothing back. The lack of closure took its toll. Fred grew more vocal in his frustration with the investigation, believing law enforcement had not acted quickly enough in the crucial early hours. Her siblings tried to keep the search alive online, creating websites, posting updates, and reaching out to true crime communities for any fresh leads. Yet over time, public attention began to drift to other cases, other names. The years that followed did not soften the wound. Every so often, a possible sighting would jolt the family back into a frenzied hope, only for it to collapse under scrutiny. In 2006, a small bone fragment was found near a home in New Hampshire, prompting speculation that it might be connected to Maura. Tests later showed it belonged to an animal. In 2011, a tip led police to search a property not far from the crash site, using ground-penetrating radar to look for signs of disturbed earth. Nothing came of it. Even small coincidences could feel ominous. In 2012, Fred learned about an unsolved disappearance of another young woman, not far from where Maura went missing, raising questions about whether the same predator could be responsible. The possibility was chilling, that someone could know those woods well enough to make a person disappear without a trace, and never be caught. As the 10th anniversary approached, the case took on an almost mythic status among online sleuths. Forums filled with painstakingly mapped timelines, satellite images, and endless debate about her state of mind in the days before she vanished. Some pointed to the mysterious phone calls and emails, suggesting Maura was under unbearable pressure. Others noted the alcohol in her car, and wondered if the crash had been the final push toward a decision she had already made. But none of it answered the central question: where was she? The Murray family kept returning to New Hampshire, year after year. Each February, they gathered near the crash site for a candlelight vigil. Standing in the cold, surrounded by neighbors and strangers alike, they spoke her name into the still night air. Sometimes, in those moments, the quiet felt heavy, as if the forest itself was listening. In later years, search technology improved. Drones were flown over the rugged terrain, covering ground far faster than human searchers ever could. Cadaver dogs were brought back to sniff out any trace of remains, and dive teams explored ponds that had been overlooked or frozen over during the initial searches. Each new attempt felt like a step closer, but always ended with the same absence. Theories continued to shift. Some investigators believed she had accepted a ride from someone passing by after the crash, leading her to a fate far from the immediate area. Others thought she could still be somewhere in those woods, hidden by the depth and remoteness of the terrain. Those who knew the White Mountains well spoke of their unforgiving nature, how in winter, even the prepared could vanish without a trace, and how the snow had a way of erasing all evidence. Fred never stopped insisting that his daughter had been the victim of foul play. He knew her flaws, her struggles, and the mistakes she had made, but he also knew she had plans for the future: nursing school, a fresh start. He refused to believe she had simply chosen to walk away from it all without telling anyone. For him, the truth was simple: someone had taken her, and that someone had never been found. In the years since her disappearance, Maura's case has remained open, a haunting mystery that refuses to fade. It lingers in the minds of those who have studied it, walked the roads she last traveled, or stood in the cold air by the curve in Route 112, where her Saturn came to rest. There is an unease about it, the way the facts end abruptly, leaving a void filled only by speculation. For her family, that void is the hardest part. There is no grave to visit, no confirmed last moment, only the crash site and the endless mountains beyond. Each time they return, they trace the same route she might have taken, scanning the trees, the riverbanks, and the old dirt roads for anything that could end their waiting. But the forest remains silent, the road remains unchanged, and Maura's story, despite countless hours of searching and years of questions, stays frozen in that February night, suspended in uncertainty. Even now, when the wind moves through the bare trees along Route 112, there's a sense that somewhere, hidden in the vastness, the truth waits, and that one day someone might stumble upon it. Until then, Her disappearance stands as one of the most haunting unsolved cases in modern American history, a reminder of how quickly a life can vanish, and how deeply its absence can echo through the years.
On the morning of October 8th, 2009, in the quiet town of Smithville, Tennessee, the sun had just begun to crest over the rolling hills. The community was small, the kind of place where nearly everyone knew each other, and where the rhythm of daily life moved without much interruption from the outside world. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked during the day, where gossip traveled fast, but crime was something seen more often on television than in their own streets. And so when 31-year-old Jennifer Hill disappeared without warning, the ripple of unease that swept through Smithville was immediate and deep. Jennifer was not a woman who blended into the background. She had a warm, open face framed by chestnut hair that fell in loose waves to her shoulders, and an easy smile that made people feel welcome in her presence. Friends often spoke about her ability to make you feel as though you were the most important person in the room. She was a single mother to a 7-year-old boy named Caleb, her pride and joy. She worked at the local pharmacy, where she'd been employed for nearly 8 years. Customers knew her by name, and she in turn knew theirs. Her life on the surface seemed stable, but those closest to her knew she had been under some strain in recent months. Her hours at the pharmacy had been cut due to budget issues, and she had taken on a second job cleaning offices at night. There were rumors too about a relationship that had ended badly, a man from a nearby town who, according to friends, didn't take the breakup well. But Jennifer, ever private about her personal troubles, brushed off concerns and assured everyone she was fine. On that October morning, Jennifer was seen dropping Caleb off at school just after 7:30 a.m. She had been wearing jeans, a blue sweater, and a lightweight jacket. She waved to one of the other parents, then drove off in her silver 2004 Honda Civic. She was supposed to be at the pharmacy by 8 a.m., but she never arrived. At first, no one panicked. Smithville was small, and people ran late sometimes. But when Jennifer didn't show up for her evening cleaning shift either, and her phone went straight to voicemail, alarm bells began to ring. Caleb's grandparents picked him up from school, and by nightfall Jennifer's parents were at the local police station reporting her missing. What followed was a search effort that would consume the community. The police started with the usual questions. Had she been depressed? Did she have enemies? Was there any chance she had chosen to leave on her own? Her family was adamant. No, absolutely not. Jennifer would never leave her son. The first break came 2 days later, when her car was found abandoned along a rural stretch of Route 56, about 15 miles from town. The vehicle was locked, and inside were her purse, wallet, and phone. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious damage to the car, no footprints or tire marks in the soft dirt nearby. It was as if Jennifer had simply stepped out and vanished into the Tennessee countryside. The search intensified. Volunteers combed the woods and fields, dogs were brought in, and helicopters swept the area from above. But nothing, no clothing, no personal items, no trace of Jennifer, was found. As days passed without answers, investigators began to turn over other stones. That's when they learned more about the man she had been seeing, a construction worker named David Ray. According to friends, their relationship had been intense but short-lived, ending abruptly in August when Jennifer decided things were moving too fast. One friend claimed Jennifer told her David had shown up uninvited at her home late at night on more than one occasion, and that he had a temper. Police brought him in for questioning, but he denied any involvement in her disappearance. He claimed he had been working a late shift out of town the night she went missing. His alibi was thin, but it was enough to keep him from being immediately charged. The small-town unease began to morph into something darker, a quiet fear that someone among them might have done something unspeakable. Parents kept closer watch on their children. Women made sure to check their back seats before getting into their cars. The town's sense of safety had been fractured, replaced by whispers in the aisles of the grocery store and uneasy glances across diner booths. Jennifer's parents, Linda and Thomas Hill, became the public face of the search. They appeared on local news stations, pleading for information. Linda's voice would sometimes break mid-sentence, her grief evident even in short interviews. "Please, she said during one televised appeal. "If you know something, if you've seen something, we just want our daughter home." But the days became weeks, and the weeks became months. Leads would surface, a possible sighting at a gas station in Kentucky, a rumor that she had been spotted in Nashville, but each one fizzled into nothing. The case was beginning to drift toward the dreaded realm of cold cases. Still, there were details that stuck in investigators' minds, things that didn't add up. Jennifer's car, for one. Why abandon it in such a conspicuous location? And why lock it, leaving her essentials inside? It didn't fit the profile of someone voluntarily disappearing, nor did it entirely match the hallmarks of a random abduction. There was also something else, something a neighbor had mentioned almost in passing. 2 nights before she vanished, Jennifer had been outside unloading groceries from her car when a dark pickup truck slowed as it passed her house. The driver had stopped briefly, as if to look, before pulling away. The neighbor hadn't gotten the license plate, and at the time it seemed like nothing. Now, in the context of Jennifer's disappearance, it felt chilling. The image of that dark truck would linger in the minds of both investigators and the Hill family for years to come, a shadow passing through the quiet streets of Smithville, perhaps carrying the last person to see Jennifer alive. The hours after Jennifer Hill's sudden disappearance unfolded like a sequence of events no one in her quiet Pennsylvania town had rehearsed for. Her absence from work was unusual enough to send ripples of worry through her colleagues. She had been a steady, reliable presence, a woman who took her schedule seriously, and whose habits were almost ritualistic. When she failed to arrive at the office that morning, the receptionist called her cell phone. It rang through, then went to voicemail. By noon, her manager had called her family. Her younger sister, Melanie, was the first to answer. She brushed it off at first, assuming Jennifer might have been ill or had car trouble. But by the time Melanie left 2 more messages that went unanswered, she felt the first creeping sense of unease. Jennifer was not the type to ignore calls, especially from family. When Melanie drove to her sister's small brick house on the edge of town that evening, she noticed the first detail that would stick in her mind for years. Jennifer's silver sedan was parked neatly in the driveway, its hood cool to the touch. The front door was locked. Nothing about the porch, the planters, or the welcome mat looked disturbed. Melanie knocked, called her sister's name, and then circled to the back. The kitchen light was on, glowing softly through the curtains. She peered through the glass. Jennifer's purse sat on the counter, her wallet and keys inside. Melanie's heart sank. She called Jennifer's best friend Allison, who arrived within 15 minutes. Together they decided to contact the police. The officers who arrived that night treated it as a missing person case but kept their tone measured. Adults, they explained, sometimes left on their own accord. Maybe Jennifer needed space, or perhaps she had gone to visit someone without telling anyone. But neither Melanie nor Allison believed that for a moment. Jennifer had responsibilities, her mortgage, her job, her family commitments, and she was not impulsive. The officers did a quick walkthrough of the home once Melanie let them in. Jennifer's shoes were lined up by the door. The ones she usually wore to work were still there. A half-finished cup of tea sat cold on the kitchen table. Upstairs, the bed was neatly made, as though no one had slept there the previous night. They found no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, nothing overturned. The only thing out of place was absence itself, her absence from a life she was known to keep in careful order. The next morning, the search widened. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. A retiree across the street mentioned seeing Jennifer retrieve her mail the previous evening, just before dusk. She'd been wearing a gray cardigan and jeans, and she'd waved politely before going inside. Another neighbor thought she heard a car door slam sometime later that night, though she couldn't say if it was Jennifer's or someone else's. By mid-afternoon, law enforcement had traced her last confirmed communication, a short text message to Allison at 6:42 p.m. that simply read, "Call you later." Allison swore there was nothing strange about it. Jennifer had often sent quick messages like that when she was busy. But the fact that later never came gnawed at her. Detectives began to consider whether Jennifer had left voluntarily. But if that was the case, why leave behind her car, purse, wallet and phone charger?
Why leave tea cooling on the table, as if she had only stepped outside for a moment? Melanie kept insisting Jennifer wouldn't just vanish. 3 days later, the first real lead came from a gas station clerk 5 miles away. Reviewing security footage for unrelated reasons, the clerk noticed a woman resembling Jennifer entering the store late on the night she disappeared. She wasn't alone. A man tall, wearing a dark hoodie, stood close beside her, his hand briefly touching her elbow as they moved toward the refrigerated drinks. The footage had no sound, but it showed the man making the purchase, the woman standing off to the side. Then they left together. When the footage was shown to Melanie and Allison, both said the woman looked strikingly like Jennifer, though the angle was grainy. Detectives couldn't be certain either way. If it was her, what was she doing there so late, and who was the man? No one at the gas station remembered seeing the pair in person that night, and the clerk on duty said the man kept his head down the entire time. The police released stills from the footage to the public. Tips began to trickle in, but most led nowhere. Some claimed to have seen a similar couple at a diner off the interstate. Others thought the man resembled someone from another county. Nothing conclusive emerged. While investigators sifted through leads, Jennifer's family and friends organized searches. They combed through wooded areas, fields, and abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town. Volunteers showed up in work boots and raincoats, holding flashlights even in daylight, driven by the stubborn hope of finding something, a scrap of clothing, a footprint, anything. Each day that passed without a discovery deepened the quiet dread hanging over everyone involved. Behind the scenes, detectives began digging into Jennifer's personal life. They found little that could explain a disappearance. She had no known enemies, no significant debts, no history of mental illness. Friends described her as cautious, even wary of strangers. She wasn't the sort to take late-night trips with someone she didn't know well. But there was one detail that emerged in the weeks before her disappearance. Jennifer had told Allison she thought she was being watched. It wasn't a dramatic confession, more of an offhand remark. She'd noticed the same unfamiliar car parked down the street on multiple occasions. Sometimes she thought she saw someone standing near it, but by the time she looked again, the figure would be gone. Allison had teased her about being paranoid, and Jennifer had laughed it off. But now, with her missing, those comments seemed far more ominous. The police explored this angle, checking traffic camera footage, and canvassing nearby streets for security systems that might have caught the car. They found nothing concrete. Still, the possibility that Jennifer had been stalked took hold in the investigation. 1 week after she vanished, another disturbing detail surfaced. A man in a neighboring town reported finding a single gray cardigan lying in a ditch near the road, partially covered in leaves. It matched the one Jennifer had been seen wearing the night she disappeared. Forensic testing would take days, but Melanie felt a cold certainty when she held the garment. It was Jennifer's. The cardigan was damp from recent rain, but there were no obvious tears or bloodstains. It was as if someone had simply dropped it there. The discovery reignited the search efforts. Detectives concentrated on the area around the ditch, which bordered a stretch of dense woodland. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their handlers methodically sweeping the terrain. The dogs alerted in a few areas, but nothing conclusive was found. No other items of Jennifer's were recovered. As the investigation pressed on, whispers began circulating through town. Some speculated that Jennifer might have met someone online, perhaps someone she hadn't told her friends about. Others feared she had been abducted by a stranger passing through, someone who knew how to leave no trace. A smaller number clung to the hope that she had left on her own, for reasons no one yet understood. Detectives worked quietly, following each lead to exhaustion. They examined her phone records, email accounts, and social media activity. Most of her last communications were routine: messages to co-workers, a grocery order confirmation, a short exchange with Allison. There was one call, however, that drew their attention, a 2-minute conversation with a number traced to a prepaid cell phone purchased in cash. The call took place less than an hour before she was last seen retrieving her mail. The phone was never used again. With that, the picture began to shift. Whoever Jennifer had spoken to that night might have been the last person to hear her voice, and the fact that the phone was untraceable suggested planning. By the second week, Jennifer's name and photograph were in newspapers across the state. Volunteers still gathered each morning to search, though their expressions grew heavier. At night, Melanie lay awake replaying every conversation she'd had with her sister over the past month, searching for anything she might have missed. A clue, a warning, a subtle goodbye. She kept returning to one moment, Jennifer's voice, low and hesitant, saying, "Sometimes I feel like someone's just waiting for me." In the police station, the detectives pinned Jennifer's photo above a growing map dotted with red markers, citing search areas, places of interest. The cardigan's discovery remained their only physical evidence. Everything else was fragments: a grainy video, a prepaid phone, an unnamed man in a hoodie, and somewhere, if the worst fears were true, Jennifer Hill's final hours had already been decided long before anyone noticed she was gone. The weeks that followed Jennifer Hill's disappearance slowly unraveled a web far more complex and shadowed than anyone in her small town had imagined. As the days stretched into months, the initial flurry of hope dimmed, replaced by a haunting uncertainty that settled over everyone who loved her. Detectives working the case became increasingly convinced that Jennifer had not vanished by chance or whim. The detail of the prepaid phone, the mysterious man in the hoodie, the abandoned cardigan, all pointed towards someone watching, someone planning, someone waiting. The very notion that Jennifer might have been lured, coerced or forced into silence, twisted the investigation into darker terrain. The police revisited the gas station footage multiple times, each viewing revealing new observations. The man seen with Jennifer appeared careful, cautious, his face mostly hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. He moved deliberately, never looking directly at the camera. His body language was oddly familiar to some officers, reminiscent of a pattern they'd seen in other cases involving abductions or stalking. But no matches emerged from local databases. The man seemed to exist just beyond reach, a ghost in a hoodie. At the same time, the community grappled with its own quiet fears. Jennifer's disappearance punctured the illusion of safety that many had taken for granted. Mothers whispered about locking doors, neighbors glanced suspiciously at strangers passing through. The police station saw an influx of reports about cars lingering too long on streets, unfamiliar faces in parking lots, late-night knocks that quickly vanished. In Jennifer's own family, the grief and frustration were raw and relentless. Melanie became an almost permanent fixture at the police station, poring over updates, offering tips, pleading for leads. Allison, too, channeled her pain into organizing vigils, putting up posters, keeping Jennifer's memory alive in every corner of the town. Meanwhile, detectives widened their scope beyond the immediate area. They searched through records of similar cases in neighboring counties and states, looking for any thread that might connect the man in the hoodie to a larger pattern. There was a vague unease among the team, a sense that Jennifer's case might be one piece in a far more disturbing puzzle. One breakthrough came unexpectedly. A woman from a town 30 miles away called the detective assigned to Jennifer's case after seeing the news coverage. She reported a strange encounter she'd had weeks before Jennifer disappeared. According to her, a man matching the description of the hoodie-wearing figure had approached her while she was at a diner. He was polite but insistent, asking for directions to a remote road. The woman's description matched the man in the gas station footage eerily well. She also recalled noticing a grey cardigan draped over the back of a chair at the diner, an item that struck her as out of place given the chilly spring evening. Though she hadn't realized it at the time, the cardigan resembled the one Jennifer had been wearing. This new lead galvanized investigators. They scoured the diner's security footage from the days surrounding Jennifer's disappearance. There, hidden in grainy black and white frames, was the man again, his face always obscured, his movements measured and unhurried. He was seen speaking to various patrons, but always briefly, never lingering. What unnerved the detectives most was a pattern they noticed. The man seemed to favor lonely, quiet places on the edges of town, gas stations, diners, small parking lots, places where someone might feel isolated or vulnerable. At this point, Forensic work on the cardigan returned with inconclusive results. No DNA, other than Jennifer's, was found, and there were no visible signs of struggle. It was as if the cardigan had been carefully removed and discarded, left to be found but without a trace of what had happened next. Theories began to form, tentative and chilling. Perhaps Jennifer had been followed for days or weeks, her routine watched and mapped out by the man in the hoodie. Maybe the phone call she made to the prepaid number was a desperate reach to the person who was manipulating her, or a silent plea. The idea of coercion or abduction became harder to dismiss. Detectives also revisited Jennifer's last known movements in painstaking detail. On the afternoon before she disappeared, she had visited a local hardware store, purchasing supplies for a small home repair project. The clerk there remembered her well, her focused manner, the casual conversation about spring cleaning and plans for the coming weekend. She had seemed calm, maybe a little distracted, but otherwise nothing alarming. Later she stopped at a nearby cafe for a quick coffee. The barista recalled Jennifer glancing nervously toward the street several times, as if expecting someone or watching for something. The same barista had also noticed a man loitering near the entrance, someone who left abruptly when Jennifer arrived. All these pieces, when viewed together, painted a picture of a woman who might have sensed she was in danger but wasn't yet sure how to respond. The emotional toll on Jennifer's family was immense. Melanie described nights filled with restless dreams, haunted by the possibility that her sister was suffering somewhere, trapped and unheard. Allison, who had shared years of friendship and confidences with Jennifer, struggled to reconcile the image of the woman she knew, a vibrant, independent person, with the chilling reality of the unknown fate that awaited her. Local media coverage sparked a mix of sympathy and unease. Articles and broadcasts portrayed Jennifer's disappearance with a somber tone, emphasizing the human cost rather than sensational details. But inevitably, speculation crept in, questions about who might have wanted to harm her, whether she had enemies no one knew about, or if her life had contained hidden troubles. One detail stood out starkly amidst the uncertainty. Jennifer had made a point in the weeks before vanishing to talk openly about personal boundaries and safety with friends and family. She had attended a self-defense workshop, and even joined a neighborhood watch group, actions that now seemed tragically prescient. The investigation uncovered no evidence that Jennifer was involved in any risky behavior, no drugs, no questionable relationships, no debts. Instead, she appeared to be a woman trying to take control of her life, preparing to safeguard herself against something unseen. Detectives also reached out to psychological profilers, who suggested that the man in the hoodie might be what's known as a shadow predator, someone who operates quietly, observes without revealing themselves, and strikes when the opportunity arises. This profile fit the pattern of stalking and abduction cases, where the perpetrator manipulates their target's routine, isolating them from support before making their move. Despite the painstaking efforts, no direct contact from Jennifer ever surfaced after her disappearance. No ransom demands, no messages. The silence was a heavy presence, one that filled the spaces where answers should have been. With each passing month, the investigation shifted from searching for Jennifer to trying to understand what might have happened. Police continued to follow leads, but the case grew colder. The community held memorials, keeping her memory alive in the absence of closure. Melanie and Allison refused to give up. They kept Jennifer's social media profiles active, hoping to spark new tips, and connected with families of other missing persons to share information and support. They understood that Jennifer's story was part of a wider narrative of disappearances that left families suspended between hope and grief. The man in the hoodie remained elusive, his identity a persistent mystery. Detectives wondered if he was still out there, watching, or if he had moved on, leaving behind only the fading traces of a life disrupted. In the quiet moments, those who loved Jennifer thought about what she might have endured in her last hours, whether she fought or was taken without resistance, whether she was held somewhere dark and cold, or if she had somehow escaped into the night. Each scenario was a thread of pain woven into their collective mourning. Jennifer Hill's disappearance became a haunting reminder of how fragile safety can be, How easily the familiar can dissolve into fear. The unanswered questions lingered like shadows in the corners of homes, in the spaces between conversations, in the hollow ache of absence, and in that lingering silence, the search for truth and justice remained unyielding, an echo carried by those who refused to forget. The investigation into Jennifer Hill's disappearance settled into a painful rhythm, one marked by long silent nights, endless paperwork, and the occasional flicker of hope that was almost always extinguished. As time passed, the community's collective anxiety deepened, wrapping itself around the lives of everyone touched by her absence, especially her family, friends and the officers who had poured so much into finding her. In the months after the initial search faded, the case took on the hollow quality that many unresolved disappearances carry. The absence of clear answers left an open wound that refused to heal. Jennifer's family found themselves trapped in a liminal space, caught between the impossible hope that she might one day return, and the terrifying possibility that she was gone forever. For Melanie, Jennifer's younger sister, every day was a struggle to hold on to memories while facing the emptiness of her sister's missing presence. She replayed the last conversations they had shared, clinging to the smallest details. Jennifer's laugh, the way she would furrow her brow when concentrating, the casual way she had spoken about mundane things that suddenly felt so precious. Each recollection was a bittersweet anchor to a life that had vanished too soon. Allison, Jennifer's closest friend since childhood, found her grief taking a different shape. She threw herself into activism, determined to use Jennifer's case to bring awareness to the dangers lurking quietly in seemingly safe neighborhoods. Allison began organizing community safety workshops and collaborated with law enforcement to improve outreach on stalking and domestic violence prevention. In many ways, the disappearance became a catalyst for change, a dark spark that ignited conversations about safety and vigilance. But for all the awareness raised, no one could answer the most urgent question: what had really happened to Jennifer? Police detectives maintained their investigation with dogged determination, knowing that even a small clue could break the case open. Over the following year, they followed leads from tip lines, scanned surveillance footage from nearby towns, and revisited cold cases that might connect to the man in the hoodie seen at the gas station. At one point, they uncovered a possible link to a drifter with a history of similar crimes in the region. The man had been arrested years earlier for assault and stalking, but was released due to lack of evidence. When questioned again, he denied any involvement in Jennifer's disappearance, and the case against him never gained enough traction. The man in the hoodie became a haunting specter in the investigation. Some speculated he was a stranger who targeted vulnerable women, carefully selecting victims and covering his tracks with chilling precision. Others wondered if he might have known Jennifer, a shadowy figure who had followed her routine until the right moment. One theory suggested Jennifer might have encountered him by chance, perhaps at the gas station or cafe, and that a momentary trust had been exploited. Another considered that she might have been lured away, convinced she was meeting a friend or responding to an emergency. Despite these possibilities, no definitive answers ever emerged. The cardigan, carefully preserved as evidence, remained an enigmatic relic, its only certainty being that it belonged to Jennifer and was left behind in a moment of crisis. Jennifer's social media accounts, once lively with posts and messages, gradually fell silent, maintained only by her family as a digital memorial. Friends and strangers alike left messages of support and remembrance, creating a tapestry of empathy woven from the threads of a collective loss. The town held vigils every year on the anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance. Hundreds gathered, lighting candles that flickered in the night like fragile beacons of hope. They shared stories about her kindness, her laughter, and her unwavering spirit. These gatherings became both a tribute and a protest, a demand for answers, and a refusal to let her memory fade. In private, Melanie and Allison wrestled with their grief in different ways. Melanie sought solace in journals, writing letters she hoped Jennifer might one day read. Allison found comfort in advocacy, channeling her pain into helping others at risk. The psychological impact on the family was profound. Sleep became elusive, Nightmares were frequent. Anxiety and depression took root, often hidden behind forced smiles and attempts to maintain normalcy. The uncertainty, the not knowing, was a constant torment, worse than any certainty of loss. Experts involved in the case noted that Jennifer's story reflected the experiences of many missing persons, the slow erosion of hope, the weight of unanswered questions, and the persistent ache left behind. They emphasized the importance of community support, trauma counseling, and sustained law enforcement attention to keep such cases alive. Years passed, and technology advanced. New forensic methods allowed investigators to re-examine evidence, searching for DNA traces or digital footprints that had previously gone unnoticed. They reached out to Jennifer's acquaintances and scanned social media networks for any hint of contact or activity under aliases.
Occasionally, there were false leads. Reports of women resembling Jennifer spotted in distant towns, calls from people claiming to have seen her. Each time, the family braced for hope, only to face fresh disappointment. Despite these setbacks, the investigation remained open. The detective in charge, having committed years to the case, often spoke quietly about the challenges of dealing with disappearances. He acknowledged how the lack of closure affected not only the families, but also those sworn to find answers. He described the man in the hoodie as emblematic of the unknown dangers that sometimes lurk within communities, figures who operate in the shadows, exploiting trust and vulnerability. The detective hoped that someday, through persistence or chance, a breakthrough might occur. Jennifer's disappearance also cast a long shadow over the town itself. What had once been a place of quiet familiarity now carried an undercurrent of unease. Parents held their children closer, neighbors watched more vigilantly, and the collective memory of Jennifer's absence became a silent, enduring presence. The story of Jennifer Hill, marked by fragments, a discarded cardigan, a prepaid phone, a glimpse of a shadowed man, remained a puzzle that refused to be solved. It was a reminder of how quickly life's fabric can unravel, how safety can slip through fingers, and how grief can linger in the spaces where light once lived. For those who knew and loved her, Jennifer was more than a case number or a missing persons report. She was a sister, a friend, a daughter, a woman whose hopes and dreams were cut short by a darkness no one fully understood. And so the search continues, not just for answers, but for peace, for the quiet hope that Jennifer might somehow be found, for the enduring wish that no one else will have to face the emptiness left behind when a life is stolen without explanation. In the stillness of night, when the world is hushed and memories stir, those who hold Jennifer close listen for a whisper, a sign that her story is not over, that somewhere in the vast unknown she remains. The unknown can be a heavy burden, but it also carries the faintest glimmer of possibility, the fragile thread of hope that sustains those who refuse to forget.